Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on near real-time monitoring of food crisis risks, organized by the Food Security Portal, which is facilitated by the International Food Policy Research Institute and also sponsored by the European Commission. On the Food Security Portal, we have an early warning, early action systems hub, which tries to identify all the various mechanisms that try to identify food crisis and food crisis risks in order to form action to prevent and mitigate the implications of food crisis and food security around the world. A recent report published by the Food Security Information Network, the Global Report on Food Crisis, identified 135 million people in acute crisis level food insecurity in 2019, mainly caused by conflict, weather shocks, and economic crises. This year, COVID-19 probably will put many more people at the brink of hunger and food insecurity, maybe even of biblical proportions, as some news reports would have it. Can we better anticipate these risks? And do we know how much exactly COVID-19 may already be affecting food crisis, food people in situation of food crisis around the world? How good are the existing early warning systems, and how can we do better? Particularly in this webinar, we want to focus on those systems that can identify these risks near real time, better, but at least in a way that can anticipate the worst from happening in order that policymakers and international aid agency can take timely action. So what we want to do at this webinar is take stock of what is being developed in terms of near real-time monitoring systems, assess how good they are, how well they can inform policymakers and international aid agencies in order to respond timely. And we also ask the question, should we better work more together? Because there's various systems, as we will hear from the various speakers and the panelists, or maybe they should each on their own try to find the best ways moving forward, like we're trying now to have a race towards a vaccine against COVID-19. So I have a very interesting panel for you and also a set of questions. Maybe you can put up the next slide with the questions for this webinar. Already mentioned the key questions. I want to take stock of the critical advances made towards real measurement of food crisis risk. What are the constraints in doing so, and what needs to be improved, and also, as I mentioned, what opportunities would there be for collaboration among these institutions and research groups? So we have 7 panelists to introduce the theme to you and showcase what they are doing, what they are developing, and how far they are along this road. They will each speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and after that we'll have hopefully a very lively and interactive discussion with all of you that are online. If you want to raise questions, you should do that in the webinar chat box, and please keep your questions pointed and indicate to whom you would like to address the questions so we can organize them in an effective way and get the responses from the various panelists. You can already start now posing your questions, or as we move forward, so that we can immediately start after the intervention of the panelists with the Q&A session and a discussion on the topic. I'll introduce the speakers as they take the floor, but we'll start with 3 presentations from what I would call the practitioners in the field, those that work with international organizations that are in the field of not only of assessing and identifying food crisis risk, but also have response mechanisms to try and address those risks and help hungry and food insecure people around the world. So the first speaker will be Arif Hussain, who is the chief economist at the World Food Programme and also is leading the World Food Programme's vulnerability analysis and mapping system. And he's also a co-collaborator on the global reports on food crisis. And Arif will be showing the work done by WFP on the global hunger. So let me give the floor to Arif. You have the floor.
Thank you, Rob. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. So I will take you through the story of our remote monitoring, and very quickly end by showing you what we are doing right now in terms of remote monitoring. So we essentially started dealing with remote monitoring in 2012 in Goma, DRC. And the idea was to, just in a little IDP camp, could we use phones to ask people questions about their consumption? What do they eat? How often do they eat? How do they cope in terms of disasters? And what else can they tell us about their lives? I mean, it started that simple. And we were trying 3 ways. One was to talk about through voice, phone voice. The other one was trying SMSs and also trying robocalls, automated calls. And we continued to do that, but we got our breakthrough in terms of remote monitoring during the Ebola crisis of 2014, 2015. And because of the disease and because of in 3 West African countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, people were looking for ways to see how they can get information without putting lives at danger by sending people in to ask questions about food security. And this thing came up and said, oh, you guys have been trying this thing in Goma, can we try it? And long story short, from there, doing it in 3 countries, we went up to over 30 countries. And the principles which we have kept in order to do this have been, 1, if you can ask, they can tell. So it is not only you can use the same system which you're using to ask people about what their food security situation is, but that also allows them to tell you what they want to tell you, whether it is about your distributions or it is about something else which would be on their mind. The second thing which we learned was that whenever there is some kind of a crisis, whether it is conflict, whether it is disease, things are changing quite rapidly. So it does not really make sense to ask lots and lots of questions knowing that the next day or next week, their situation is going to change. So what we focused on was ask less, but ask often. And through phones, obviously, you cannot have half an hour, 40-minute interview with someone on that regular basis. So it worked quite well. The third thing which we found was that there is value in 2 things. One is the value in the information and the knowledge that you collect through these systems. But these systems by themselves, these platforms are also valuable. Why? Because if we can ask about food security, somebody can, using the same platform, could ask about health or social protection or just general poverty. And that is where then the partnerships start to come in. So we can do this, we have partnership with FAO, we have partnership with the World Bank, in terms of using the same platforms for many things to get that information out. Now, I know we have very little time, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you that in 8 years, where have we gotten to? And if you want to follow along, this is called hungermap.wfp.org. You can go check it out. And here, very quickly, if I can move, I don't know if you can see my whole screen sorry, this is, basically here you have, you can see how the number of people who have insufficient food intake that is changing in real time in 90 plus countries. And these 90 plus countries involve about, till by the end of this month, in 30 countries, this is real data. And then in the rest of the countries, it is now casting off the data which already exists. You can also see that 17 is the number of countries with very high levels of hunger. And these buttons which you're seeing, highlighted in light violet and purple color, they essentially tell you where the COVID cases are doubling in 3 days and where they are doubling in 7 days. And this map by itself is talking about insufficient food intake. Now, what you can also do, I will go through this and then I'll show you what at the country level is you can put down different types of hazards. These are, by the way, in real time. So these are essentially the climatic hazards. If you want to look at, okay, so I'm not interested in climate, but I'm interested in conflict, you can see battles, riots, violence against, and this again is in real time. Now, if you want to go and say, no, okay, hazards are okay, conflict is okay, let's talk about vegetation, you can see how the vegetation is changing, again, in high frequency data. And then if you want to know about rainfall, you can go to rainfall and see how that is performing. And in our business, obviously nothing without IPC. So this is the IPC Phase Classification, which puts people in different countries in different phases, meaning, phase 1, if you're okay, phase 2, if you're stressed, phase 3, if you're in emergency, phase 4, phase 3 if you're in crisis, phase 4 if you're in emergency, and phase 5 if it is in a catastrophe. Now, the number which Rob mentioned, 135 million, that is people in crisis, meaning phase 3 and above on the IPC side. So now, let's go to, so this was kind of like on the global side. You saw, I cannot see that part because it's hidden on my screen, but you saw that we can also have the COVID numbers broken down by income classifications and things like that. Then what you can do is say, okay, you know what, this is good, this is global, but tell me what's happening in the countries. So you can go to, let's pick Yemen, for example. Okay, so you can go pick Yemen, and here comes Yemen. Now here, basically, you have some key indicators. You can see number of population, you can see those with insufficient food intake, what is the nutrition situation, how the food security trends are changing, what are the coping strategies that people are using, what is their import dependence, how is inflation performing, how is the exchange rate, is it stabilized or it's not? And then you can essentially go down on this here, you see what is the COVID situation in the country. And by the way, this is 1 day lag. And then you can go to a particular province and look at, okay, so in Alhambra, for example, 26% of the population is with insufficient food intake. Or you can see that 38% of the population is with coping at a crisis level. So this part, plus now going back to what I was showing you earlier, you can put down, okay, where is the big conflicts happening? And you can see that you can bring this out. It's hidden by the COVID map here, but you can essentially bring this out and frankly see what is happening in this place. So The idea is, one, to see in real time how food security situation is changing. Two, to see how we can overlay some layers of concern, whether they be conflict, whether they be climate, whether they be just natural disasters or natural shocks, and now COVID, to give a complete sort of picture going forward. Now, like I said, by this end of this month, from 30 countries, we would have daily information coming out. And it is statistically significant at the 30-day level, meaning we get this information for 30 days, and then we can report and tell you what's happening in that country over those 30 days at admin 2 level. That is all I wanted to show on the platform. And back to right now, there's a lot of demand for this work, basically simply because people's ability to go out is quite limited. So what we are trying to do is, usually I say that, look, I mean, monitoring is great, remote monitoring is excellent, but at the end of the day, eyes and feet on the ground are really important to verify what you see through remote monitoring, right? But when you're dealing with situations right now, that's really not possible. So this is the second best, but it is comprehensive enough for decision makers to see, one, how things are changing or what's happening, and two, to also see if what they are doing in terms of response, that is making a dent or not. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. That's a very fascinating advance of overlaying all these types of information, and we'll have more discussion about it, and also how we get from these correlates between the factors onto the actual risk, and how we determine or can anticipate the crisis. Let me now quickly move to Laura Glaser. She is the chief of party with FuseNet, and FuseNet stands for the Famine Early Warning System Network, and she's also associated with Chemonics International. Sorry. Laura, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Rob, and good day, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel and to be able to contribute to what has become an increasingly important set of discussions, particularly over recent weeks. So before sort of diving into some of the ways that FuseNet uses near real-time monitoring to assess food security risk factors, I wanted to maybe take a brief step back for those who might be a little bit less familiar with what FuseNet is and how we do our work, to just sort of orient you to our process. So FuseNet is now in its 35th year, and across that time we have striven and continue to strive to be a leading provider of food security and early warning analysis globally. Our charge is to provide decision makers and other food security stakeholders with evidence-based, comparable, and actionable data and information on where food security conditions are deteriorating or are likely to deteriorate across more than 25 geographies that we monitor around the world. In an effort to meet increasing demands for information around food security issues, including a desire to deepen explorations of the underlying and proximate causes of food insecurity, the project's 7th phase, which commenced in 2019, leverages comparative advantages and economies of scale across a team of implementers whose work is divided into pillars. FuseNet's Pillar 1 focuses on acute food insecurity and early warning analysis, and it is on the early warning team's work that I'm presenting today. FuseNet's acute food insecurity and early warning analysis begins with an understanding of the dynamics of households' livelihoods, or the main ways that households access food and income. Our analytical framework is designed to temporally and spatially monitor multiple shocks, including agroclimatological shocks, macro and microeconomic shocks, conflict, health shocks, many of the different kinds of layers that Arif was highlighting in the hunger map that he showed just before this, and the varied impacts of those shocks on households' ability to access food and income in the geographies that we're monitoring. It's by then synthesizing the cumulative impacts on households at different levels of wealth across multiple national landscapes that the FuseNet early warning team provides at least monthly evidence-based consolidated statements on acute food needs globally. So to be able to fulfill this charge, to holistically assess available evidence to make statements each month on current and likely future acute food insecurity outcomes in the geographies that we cover, requires accessing a significant amount of near real-time monitoring data and information. And so I'll use my remaining time to highlight some of the ways that FuseNet does this. Next slide, please. So FuseNet's efforts in near real-time monitoring in the realm of acute food insecurity take both more analog and more advanced forms, and are undertaken both routinely and as part of more specialized discrete activities. Some of the more analog near real-time monitoring efforts in which we regularly engage include the collection of retail prices for key commodities, informal cross-border trade flows, casual labor wage rates, and other proximate drivers of acute food insecurity. Depending on geography, we undertake this monitoring on daily, weekly, or semi-monthly bases using a variety of methods, including direct observation through primary data collection. FuseNet enjoys a network of more than 200 monitors and enumerators who serve as some of our sort of frontline boots on the ground, or in the age of COVID-19, increasingly fingers on telephones or ears to telephones. In addition to the direct observation that we undertake through our enumerators and monitors, as well as our own direct assessments, we also collect information from a series of network partners. In addition, we leverage more advanced near real-time monitoring efforts, including remotely sensed agroclimatological imagery that is made available through our science partners, primarily NOAA, NASA, and USGS. These data are then checked or triangulated against inputs from a robust network of additional key informants, which we rely on alongside our own assessments to fill gaps, to better understand the dynamics when information and data that is available appears to be misaligning, and or when a key factor that appears to be affecting acute food insecurity isn't captured well within our recurring monitoring systems. Next slide, please. An additional means of triangulation of our near real-time monitoring, which we've begun to build out in this phase, is through the development of a global dashboard for hotspot identification, or what we are calling the JEDI. The JEDI is a tool which ingests current information on agroclimatology, market price dynamics for a relevant given livelihood zone, and uses a consistent approach to model the likely impacts of these dynamics on poor households' ability to meet their survival food needs now and into the future. The JEDI tool allows us to run analyses using near real-time monitoring data across wider geographies, and it also brings an enhanced consistency and transparency to our approach, in addition to facilitating our efforts to try to ensure that we're not missing populations who may be facing declining or declined food security conditions. A final example of some of the recurring near real-time monitoring that we do comes in our current environment. COVID-19 represents the largest shock in FuseNet's history in terms of its geographic expanse and its short and likely longer-term impacts. This has required us to amplify our monitoring efforts, to increase the frequency of our monitoring, the expanse of our monitoring, and the depth of our monitoring efforts. We're now working to collect and analyze updated data and information from the macro to the micro level on a weekly basis, and from both our more typical information sources and new information sources. I suspect this is a topic we'll discuss at some length in our discussion, so I'll leave it at there for now and move to the last slide, please. So to conclude, in addition to the recurring monitoring that we do in near real time, I wanted to highlight a couple of more discrete activities that FuseNet has done within the space of near real-time monitoring to answer specific questions, several of which we are also continuing to leverage in the age of COVID-19. One of these is that we have leveraged technologies such as mobile phone surveys, resonating a lot with some of what Arif was talking about earlier, to develop key informant networks that provided information on marketing systems in Ebola-affected areas. This is something we're starting to turn back on now with COVID-19. This technology proved critical during the Ebola crisis to allowing us to monitor the ongoing dynamics and forecast the likely future dynamics of a key element of the food security system in Ebola-affected areas that we couldn't access by more traditional means because of the public health issue. We've also used computer-assisted telephone interviewing technologies to collect recurring panel data on casual labor wage rates among select populations to better understand the dynamics of this vital income source among poor households. Finally, we've undertaken a range of activities that work to leverage high-resolution satellite imagery in addition to tracking weather and climatological changes to also understand population and livestock movements in areas of concern where civil insecurity rendered access impossible through traditional assessment means. And we're continuing to push forward the use of similar technologies in an effort to improve the precision of our understanding of area planted, a key factor for being able to better comprehend food availability in select geographies. So with that, I will step back and hand this back over to you, Rob. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Laura. Again, this is fascinating new work and leverage use of new technologies. Let's also hope for how we can see that your work and that of WFP can be maybe linked together and see how we can improve on that even more. Let me now move to Mario Zappacosta, who leads the FAO's Global Information and Early Warning System for Food and Agriculture, also known as JEWS. Mario, you have the floor, and please try and keep your presentation in 7 minutes.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks for inviting me to this nice webinar. I hope my voice comes clear because the internet seems to be quite slow. Just to introduce JEWS and what we do in one sentence, our mandate is to monitor food supply and demand across the globe. So obviously I would need much more than 5 minutes to detail and explain better what we do. So in the next few minutes, I will try to show you a few tools that we use to monitor factor risk on both food supply and demand. Next slide, please. So the first tool that I present is the so-called Agricultural Stress Index. It was developed by FAO in 2014, and it was developed by two teams, the Agromet team of the Climate and Environment Division and the JEWS of the Trade and Market. This was let's say, a very interesting combination of experts because it was done by the meteorology, the remote sensing people, together with the users, the economists, the food security analysts. So going hand in hand together, we developed a tool that was really not a an academic attempt. So it was really toward the implementation, the use in the countries. So in a nutshell, the index is a quick look indicator for the early identification of areas cultivated that have a high risk to be affected by drought. It is based on remote sensing Earth observation, and it provides near real-time information on the status of crops. Vegetation images comes from the METOP sensor that are received every 10 days with 1 kilometer resolution and are posted online as a public good. We are quite happy to use a 1 kilometer resolution because for our, let's say, global coverage of monitoring is quite a good resolution. The index is then based on 2 dimensions that are crucial for drought monitoring, the time and space. If we think about time, ASIs assess the intensity and duration of the dry periods during the season. And this calculation includes the use of specific coefficients that consider the sensitivity of crops to water stress during the growing cycle. And particularly, for example, at flowering or grain filling stage. So it's important when the drought takes place. And regarding space, ASI uses crop masks. So we are just interested where the crops are and calculates the percentage of cropland affected by drought at pixel level. Recently, we developed also the possibility to assess the severity of the drought events, and we can rank them from mild to extreme. And in the future, we are planning to have, we are working on an algorithm that may try to estimate the drought probability across the season as the season develops. The global version of ASIS has already been deployed in over 10 countries. So we moved from the global version to a country level ASI that has been calibrated based on local information. So we have much better crop masks, for example, sowing dates, better crop coefficients, sometimes for varieties that have a more or less sensitivity to water deficit, the length of the cycle, crop cycle. And to conclude on ASIS, the important aspect is that ASI information is easily understood also by analysts who are not expert on interpretation of remote sensing data. Let's say even economists like me can become a sort of remote sensing expert or agrometeorologist. If you see the 3 maps of Uganda for the last decade of April in the last 3 years, you can immediately compare the 2018 with 2019 and the current year, and you can see that where more red, it means less favorable situation. And in fact, last year there was a quite substantial drought in Uganda. ASIS has been used obviously in several national and global early warning systems to guide early actions, but also it has been used by governments for decisions on public investments, like for example irrigation or water harvesting, and also in some crop insurance schemes to fix the premium. All the information is available on the web on the address below. Next slide, please. Oops, one back. Good. So on the supply side, I would like to spend a couple of minutes on these 2 tools. One is the JUICE Food Price Monitoring Analysis Tool and Database. This is a web-based application that is used for analysis and dissemination of price information. It grants easy and open access to a large amount of data. We are talking about domestic prices for over 90 countries and over 1,400 series of prices for the main staple food. But the tool provides also exchange rates, for example, to facilitate comparison across countries, and international food prices to allow analysis about food, price transmission. We produce regularly early warnings on abnormal high domestic prices that are based on an indicator that we developed, the indicator of price anomalies, which is used also to measure progress toward one of the SDG, where we are able to get rid, let's say, of the seasonality on the prices, and really see if the price is abnormally high or seasonally high. So we can flag that on our website. All the data are available free online. And last but not least, I would like to mention the food insecurity experience scale, that is a measure that is led by our statistic, the FAO statistic department. And it's a measure of the severity of food insecurity, which is experienced either at individual or a household level, and it's based on direct interviews. The indicator can be used also in repeated and frequent assessment if we use a 30 days reference period. And we have the possibility even to expand the standard module, which is based on 8 questions, and we can include new ones and others, so we can tailor this type of indicator of this scale. And over to you, Rob. I think I made it in my time. Thanks.
Yes, you did, Mario. Thank you very much. So we've now heard 3, I think, very fascinating stories from people from international organizations that work on near real-time monitoring, and so wealth of information out there that's now much better collected and very nicely presented. I guess the next question is, and so the 4 next presenters will be come from the research community and also raise the question, so what can we make of this wealth of information, also by way of predicting, putting the elements together for analysis on the causes. So how can we better use the system, leverage them for understanding better what's going on, and subsequently how to act on it. Before I give the floor to the next speaker, let me reiterate to all online, you can already start submitting your questions in the webinar chat box. So please do so we can quickly start with the discussion after these presentations. So the first in the next block is Daniel Maxwell, who's the professor of food security at the Friedman School of Nutrition, Science and Policy at Tufts University. Daniel, you have the floor. We can't hear you, Daniel. Dan? No?
Okay, thank you. Someone unmuted me. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My comments grow out of a study that we did last year on information systems and anticipatory humanitarian action in East Africa. And in a nutshell, what we found was that there's a lot of confusion out there about different information processes and outputs, how they're related, how they're different, and what they're for. And last year, this confusion was just in the context of a funny combination of climate and conflict hazards. This year, of course, there are both of those in addition to desert locusts and COVID. So there has probably never been a more urgent time to clarify these processes and these outputs and to ensure that they provide a coherent picture to policymakers, to donors, to humanitarian actors, and to local authorities. So if we can go to slide 2, I'd just like to try and clarify a little bit some of the terminology that we use here. Current status assessments in such things as IPC analyses, etc., are about outcomes that have already occurred. They're about classifications of severity of crisis, and they're about figures for population in need. In other words, they're about hard numbers. Early warning is information about things that are likely to happen, which would either improve or worsen the situation. So it's about probabilistic information. Projections are predictions about future classifications or future numbers of population in need. So also probabilistic estimates, but with the appearance of hard numbers. So into this complicated system, we're talking about real-time monitoring, which is, in my view, information that tracks actual developments that can help us to update assumptions about early warning or projections, or to validate or change the kinds of scenarios that early warning is projecting. And especially, we shouldn't forget, it's supposed to be changing program response and preparedness, etc. So in slide 3, if we can go to that, please, Rob. Think of it like this. The causal factors are depicted here in the top row of the diagram are continuous. Monitoring changes in those causal factors is classically what early warning is about. With global tools like the Integrated Phase Classification, we now have, well, ideally, twice yearly in-depth current status assessments, which are the big bars in the bottom row here, that provide us with a current status classification and a population in need figure. If you take current status as a kind of baseline and use early warning information about causal factors, you can outline a kind of most likely scenario, and on the basis of that, make projections of both classifications and populations in need figures in the future, sometimes 3 to 4 months out, sometimes 6 to 8 months out. And that's what's depicted here in the middle row. And of course, various approaches to predictive modeling that I think we're about to hear about from some other colleagues in a moment basically do this same thing. They help us make projections into the medium-term future. Now, in-depth analysis in the form of current status assessments takes time, and those results are already somewhat dated by the time they're complete. So projections are actually a very critical component of this system. But projections 4 to 6 months out can sometimes miss the mark. So real-time monitoring, in effect, fills in the blank here with less in-depth but higher frequency information. It can't be as in-depth as a proper current status assessment, but what it can do is identify emerging hotspots, help to make course corrections to projections, etc., but also to adapt responses. So the difference here is understanding what are causal factors, what are predicted outcomes, and what are actual outcomes. So if we go to slide 4, here's an example of an actual real-time monitoring system. This one made by the Food Security and Nutrition Analysis Unit for Somalia, and they call it their early warning, early action dashboard. And this one actually does mix both actual outcomes in terms of health and nutrition with some more classic early warning indicators, both market prices and climate. And what it does is set up thresholds for alarms based on how far any given indicator is out of alignment with long-term averages. And then it counts up the number of alarms by district and month and maps them with increasing numbers of alarms colored darker, as you can see here in the maps. And interestingly, if you're examining this map, note that the years go from bottom to top, not top to bottom. So it provides a good overview of whether things are getting better or worse in between the major seasonal assessments in Somalia, and it provides information to donors and government about those trends. What this particular one does not do necessarily is inform program staff on the ground about appropriate responses. Slide 5 is another example. This one is piloted by REACH in South Sudan, and is called their Integrated Needs Tracking System, or INT. And it's similar to the dashboard in that it tracks a number of different categories of indicators that include climate and market indicators, but also include outcomes around food access, nutrition, and wash and health outcomes. It maps in a similar way with darker colors showing a more severe level of need by county and by month, as you can see here over the last 4 months that are on the current web page. But the difference here is that this system is tied into an intercluster coordinating group that reassesses responses on a monthly basis and can quickly change program priorities on the ground and signal these changes to donors. So in that sense, this is more truly oriented towards early action. So real-time monitoring kind of fills in the blanks between these major current status assessments, but it also raises some key questions which are on slide 6. The first of these is, how well does real-time monitoring inform the updating of projections and validating these against subsequent current status assessments? But more importantly, the real question, I believe, is how well does real-time monitoring inform the updating of preparedness and response? So how are results actually put into action? And then what's the most effective way of combining these two objectives? And what's the best way of integrating real-time monitoring into existing systems? Because up till now, particularly at the national and local level, they've been a little bit of an add-on to an already existing system, but it needs to be incorporated fully into those systems. That's just a brief overview of a couple of national and local level real-time monitoring systems, and we can talk about them more later. Back to you, Rob.
Thank you so much, Dan, for laying out these conceptual issues and also how to properly apply them in practice. And I particularly like also the question you raise here, which hopefully we can discuss in the discussion session, and also like to hear what Arif, Laura, and Madi have to say about these 4 questions. So with that, let me move to the next panelist, is Professor Chris Barrett. He's Professor of Applied Economics at the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. Chris, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you to IFPRI and your team for organizing this really interesting webinar. It's a pleasure to get to listen to my colleagues from WFP and FAO and FuseNet describe some of what they're using in practice to cope with emergencies like the one we face right now, and of course to listen to my colleagues at other institutions like Dan and Kathy and at the World Bank. So what I'd like to present today are some extremely preliminary results of a project several of us have underway. If you could advance slides, please. This is a USAID funded project, a multidisciplinary team of economists, geospatial scientists, and statisticians, data scientists. And the core question we're trying to ask is the following. We all understand that the really sort of the gold standards for poverty measurement and malnutrition indicators come from large scale, nationally representative surveys done with quite in-depth, careful measurement. So things like the demographic and health surveys, DHS, or the living standards measurement surveys, LSMS. But those are very slow, expensive exercises. So it takes commonly a couple of years to be able to plan, implement, and enter data, and then begin to analyze data to have a sense of what's the prevalence of acute malnutrition or child stunting or asset-based poverty or expenditure-based poverty in a given part of a country. And that sampling is also necessarily partial. We can't cover the entirety of a country. So those data commonly feed into things widely known as poverty maps or analogs to poverty maps. So the question we're trying to answer is, can we generate predictions that are tolerably accurate, that come pretty close to those gold standard DHS or LSMS type measures? Can we predict reasonably accurately out of sample if we use just publicly available near real-time data and perhaps past survey evidence? So in the back of your mind, the question you should have is, or the setting you should have is something like right now, where countries are trying to identify where is it most likely that poverty or child malnutrition or women's underweight are increasing most rapidly, such that you would want to target those particular geographies for food-based interventions. So a little more specifically, our project, which is only midway right now, so I really want to emphasize, I'm going to be reporting extremely preliminary results. Our project is first constructing some new data products. The geospatial scientists have built new SIF data, so solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, a very promising measure of vegetative growth. as well as land surface temperature data series that help to address some shortcomings in existing temperature series. Those feed into, and I'm not going to talk about those more other than to note that those data products are now available. There are forthcoming blogs from my colleagues who've spearheaded that part of the project. But now we're into the part where we are trying to use those and other publicly available series and machine learning methods to predict a suite of feed the future indicators, the indicators that USAID and the US government more broadly use to monitor progress on food security. So there are a suite of poverty and malnutrition indicators, and we're trying to do this at the scale of the enumeration areas used in these large-scale nationally representative surveys. So I'll talk about enumeration areas. Think of this as commonly an ADM2 level sampling. And we're trying to get at this question of, can we use these data streams to predict reasonably accurately such that you could update the survey data in a way that would be worth acting on? Ideally, you'd be able to replace these things. I frankly consider that doubtful. Yeah, please, if you could advance the slide. So our preliminary results. First, I want to caution that one should really beware of over-optimism. There is a research literature on using machine learning applications to try to predict poverty and malnutrition and other human development indicators. At risk of a little bit of oversimplification, we find that we can predict things like asset poverty reasonably well. Slow-moving indicators can be predicted reasonably well out of sample. Fast-moving indicators like acute malnutrition, historically virtually no predictive power out of sample. So that's sort of the backdrop on which we're trying to build. What we find is, as depicted here, overall across the 12 countries where we're predicting, the 12 Feed the Future countries, we find that by far most of the predictive power in these models, and I'll describe results in just a minute, come from pretty basic geographic features: latitude, longitude, slope, altitude, etc. Those account for about 2/3 of the explanatory power in predicting poverty and malnutrition outcomes of various sorts. As you see in the graphic on the bottom, the histogram, this shows you the percentage of the explainable variation in poverty or malnutrition indicators in our preliminary results that are explained by clusters of variables. So location being just basic geographic map features, remoteness being how far are you from major cities and a rural-urban divide. Together, these are about 2/3 of explanatory power. Measures of vegetation, crop growth, pasture growth explain a reasonable amount. Market prices are actually quite important, and I emphasize that market prices are not nearly as available as these other features. So when we condition just on the places where market prices are available, its share of the explanatory power actually jumps up to greater than that of vegetation. So a takeaway there is there's probably value to investing more in more timely and comprehensive coverage of market prices across space and time. We find weather and conflict data have far less explanatory power once you account for these other features. It's not to say that conflict doesn't matter, it obviously does, but we have very little predictive power from it. If you look on the right, the colorful graphic shows you across the countries we're covering and these same clusters of variables, how feature importance varies. You see that it's roughly similar, although location that varies dramatically across places like Uganda and Mali and in the predictive power, while for something like conflict, in no country does it seem to have a great deal of predictive power. Next slide, please. Our results suggest that there are a range of different methods in play right now. Very complicated, deep and transfer learning methods, which require considerable computational power and a good deal of skill of analysts. Those don't seem to perform appreciably better than somewhat simpler methods that we've tried. So simpler random forest methods seem to do about as well. And when we add a Gaussian process to it, for those who don't know the language, please ignore the specifics for those who think about machine learning. We find that Gaussian processes are helpful in part because they're harnessing the covariance structure of the data, that these these various data series have correlation structures. So when we predict the ensemble, we actually do better than when we predict single variables. When we try to use the past observations to predict the future, we do much better than when we just try to predict the current state off of other current state variables. So when we exploit the covariance structure, we're significantly improving the out of sample fit we're finding so far. Again, I emphasize these are preliminary results. And most exciting part is that if these results actually hold up as we continue to scrutinize the code and try lots of other stress tests on it, we're actually able to generate tolerable accuracy for malnutrition indicators for the first time. And this doesn't actually change prevalence estimates much. So on the right, that lower colorful curve graphic is showing you how the change from estimating without covariances through a Gaussian process to estimating with covariances through a Gaussian process, how that works as you move across the core prevalence estimate. So what we're showing here is that the actual change in the estimated prevalence is rather small by accounting for covariances. So for those of you who think statistically, what's really happening here is we're harnessing the correlation of errors to improve the efficiency of the prediction, to improve the precision of the prediction, but we're not actually changing the predictions themselves by very much. This seems to work especially well for things like child stunting and children of healthy weight. If you look at the table on the left, I've highlighted in red 2 different rows. Again, very preliminary results. What we find in the top row for random forests, where we just pool across all the different tasks, all the indicators in all the countries, we find what is standard in the literature. Asset poverty prediction out of sample, you get about 51% of variation is explained by the model. Not bad, nothing remarkable. You wouldn't want to bet the farm on it. And the other variables, the nutrition-related variables, very poor predictive power. You know, R-squareds of 0.03 to 0.19. That's pretty standard in the literature. But if you go to the bottom row, when we add a Gaussian process and now we do this as sequential prediction, so we're trying to predict the next round of the survey data based off of past rounds of survey data and the contemporaneous covariates, things like weather variables and vegetation and price variables, now you see that we actually get pretty good fit. In every task, the predictive power increases, and it increases most appreciably in the nutrition measures that are arguably of greatest value for trying to target for food emergencies. So this is extremely preliminary work, but we're excited that the basic insights seem to suggest that there is capacity to use past high quality survey data and contemporaneous and recent near real-time data from a variety of publicly available sources. We're only using publicly available data products, that it seems like we might be able to predict with tolerable accuracy some of these nutrition indicators, which could feed into the sorts of decision processes and visualization tools our colleagues have just described. So with that, if you could go to the next slide, I think I'm done. Yes, so with that, let me turn it back to you, Rob. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's really fascinating work, and how we can find proper correlations and maybe predictive power from these your model estimates and machine learning algorithms. And also, let's see what the others have to say that are working in the field, how they can maybe learn from that for their own real-time monitoring systems. We're getting a little bit pressed for time, so hopefully the last 2 speakers can be brief, so we have some time left for the discussion and the questions. And again, to all people online, please submit your questions in the chat box. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Kathy Bayliss of the University of Illinois, who's a professor of agriculture there and also is working on machine learning experiments on understanding better the food crisis risks. Kathy, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. So this is a sort of a nice follow-on to what Chris just presented in that we're trying some we're asking a very similar question in terms of, can we make use of publicly available data, but in this case to predict food security outcomes. So next slide, please. And one of the things we're trying to tackle here is this general issue that we have. I mean, hopefully we're trying to predict what is again hopefully a relatively rare event, and that turns out to be tricky, right? If you've got lots and lots of people, if you're trying to train a model on a situation where you see lots and lots of people in category A and lots of people in category B, it's a much easier problem than if you're trying to predict essentially a sliver of folks that are really, really poorly off. And so what we do here is, I mean, we're trying to use these publicly available data, we're using machine learning techniques, but then we're also using some of the tools that folks have made use of in things like fraud detection to try and do a better job of predicting sort of these relatively rare events. And so the way that works is you essentially try to either upsample those minority category events so that your machine is essentially learning better how to predict exactly those bad events and isn't taking as much information from the good outcomes. So that's sort of step one here. Step two is also thinking about this idea that we might be in a situation where we care a lot more about false negatives in this case, and by that I mean missing households that are in crisis, compared to having too many false positives, and by that I mean identifying food secure households as being food insecure. So we might care more about making sure that the people in need are targeted, and if we give a little bit of food aid to folks that weren't really in need, I mean, that's not efficient, but it may be a less bad outcome. So the other thing we do is sort of try and play around with penalization functions, forgive the jargon, but basically the optimization routine in the model to try and put more weight on identifying the people in need and put a little less weight on over-identifying people who might not be in need. The quick sort of punchline of this is, I think we do relatively well. So what we do is we take this to 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa: Uganda, Tanzania, and Malawi. We're using LSMS data as our sort of ground truth, to see if we can predict the food security outcomes in those data. And we're getting levels where we're actually able to predict. If you look at the table there, we're able to capture, in some cases, up to 100% of the sort of villages that are food insecure. But at worst, we're doing about 55%, which again is not great, but it's about the same as a bunch of the earlier models we're getting for asset prediction and other sort of time invariant characteristics. And these are time varying characteristics, and we actually are able to capture some degree of that time variance, which is nice. And the other thing is, when we sort of crank up that sampling, we're able to capture more of those food insecure households without losing too much in terms of accuracy. There's one caveat here, is that works relatively well when we've got, when we're not down to like 1 or 2 villages in our training data set that are food insecure or highly food insecure. When there's 1 year here in the LSMS, there was only a couple of locations that were highly food insecure. When we try to identify those, as you can imagine, things get pretty variable, and there we have to crank up. We lose a lot in terms of accuracy to try and up the recall. I want to now focus in on those maps, because so this is just one example of these predictions that we're doing. And I should mention, what we're doing is forecasting food insecurity sort of 1 month out, so 1 month before the survey data were collected. So this is for Tanzania. Again, this is using the Reduced Coping Strategies Index, which Dan Maxwell helped create. This is, if on the left-hand side, you can sort of see a standard model. And the areas circled in red are sort of, if the areas, the dots in green say where we've got the prediction right, The areas in orange are areas where we're over predicting. We're saying that those areas are more food secure than they actually are. And the areas with the red, we're doing that really badly. And if the map on the right is where we're using our machine learning model and the sort of resampling kind of methods. And as you can see, we're doing much better. Those places where we were saying those communities are not in trouble, we're now actually appropriately identifying that yes, they were. Next slide, please. The next thing we do is that, so all of that is using, again, LSMF data as sort of ground truth and trying to see, can we combine it in a way using machine learning? Like Chris was finding, we're finding things like random forests that work relatively well. But it's a bit of a cheat, frankly, because we're using things like acid information, that roof type that's coming from LSMF, not coming from truly secondary data sources. And so the extension of this is that we're trying to see how well does this work when we actually use those truly secondary data sources, in this case, satellite imagery. And so the idea here is that we're taking imagery and using that to predict things like assets, distance to road, et cetera, et cetera. And we start off with that, and we do relatively well, following sort of literature that's already out there. And then we say, okay, well, in some ways we don't care about all of those aspects separately. We care about using that prediction to say how well it can directly get to food security measures. On its own, it actually does better than we would have thought. I mean, we're predicting up to, and in that table, that's that first row in the table, we're predicting something like about 60% of the variation in food consumption scores. Not so well for RCSI. It's a harder target to map to because it's sort of you have a map point at 0. Anyway, but we're doing better than I thought, frankly. Then when we combine that with things like weather and prices, we do even slightly better again. So what this means is that from that, we can actually predict food security. And again, this is still out 1 month. This is a 1 month forecast at a grid cell level. And so that's what the map there on the right is showing, is that is a RCSI predicted for Malawi 1 month out, 1 month before the survey date. And anyway, these are tests. This is very much work in progress. We want to try and see if this works in other places as well, but I think it's suggesting that this is hopeful. There actually might be some ways that we can use the secondary data to forecast food security, and very much I see this as a supplement to kind of existing work that's going on the ground where people are actually collecting data, sort of ground level data, and like things like the work done by FuseNet or MVAM. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. It's again fascinating work in progress, as you emphasized. But hopefully we can, by comparing notes, we can take this to a next level. Particularly also how that could be made useful also for the work by the World Food Programme, FuseNet, and FBO and others on this ground. Last but not least, the next speaker is David Laborde, who's a senior research fellow at Ipc and a good colleague of mine, who's the last speaker. Hopefully can take you quick through your storyline, David, so we can have some time left for the discussion. Please take the floor, David.
Yes, thank you, Rob, and thanks for all the previous speakers. So I'm going to kind of follow up on a few things that have been already said, and many things have been said, but maybe with a different angle. And I start with this statement that most of you have already heard, that gouverner c'est prévoir, to govern is to foresee, meaning that monitoring the crisis when it has already started is actually not enough. And we need to see how we can design policy that can address this issue. Next slide, please. So, indeed, the challenge is that if you don't foresee, if you don't plan, you are going the crisis. Here on my slide, you see the idea of a traffic and visualization. And of course, monitoring real-time situation and really all the work that have been shown is great. You have seen the WFP map that provides so much information, but saying that you are already in the middle of a traffic jam is not going to help you avoiding it. And that's a bit a challenge. So yes, we need this real-time monitoring or near real-time monitoring. We need also, it has been very clear to say that in addition to all this prediction or remote sensing, we need boots on the ground to validate where we are, to get this validity check, because it's totally useless to plan if we don't even know where we start from. But actually, I am going to link this to the broader discussion, that is how we can use this to not go to the crisis, but to avoid the crisis, but at the same time also to make sure that we have the means and the policy solution to avoid it. And I'm going to show how we can actually implement it, because in order to have the right policies and the smart policies to answer the crisis, we need both knowledge and actually money, and money that will be in the hands of, I will say, the local governments that can take care of this constituency and not just rely on global charity. Next slide, please. So when you already have a different discussion about what drive actually this crisis, both in terms of key driver like weather or conflict, but in order to know how these different drivers actually impact people on the short term, but also on the medium term, and that will be an additional point of information I want to bring. You know, in the middle of the crisis, people want to save, first of all, life, and so the minimal food security target, but we need also to protect livelihood and to make sure that people are not losing their assets, in particular in the context where a series of crises can happen, and we don't want to mismanage the current crisis that will basically erode the resilience for future crises. So we want to take care of life, we want to avoid famine, but we want also to keep in mind that livelihood is important, and therefore we need to capture both how the different shocks impact the system, but how the system reacts in terms of market and economic drivers. You know, it's not just like if households are small people disconnected with a little plot and the little garden. No, they are part of an economic ecosystem that is integrated locally, regionally, globally, where different type of policies and even crises, and I think the COVID-19 crisis is a good example, interact. But of course, the feature of each household matters. So really, we need to have this macro, meso, and micro level of information. Next slide, please. So also, I think that most of the people are familiar with this, but we are not just talking about availability of food. So thinking that by monitoring a supply side shock, we get the final word. No, we are really intending in access. So income matters a lot. And here also, I think the COVID-19 crisis is quite important. So here I am showing the type of framework we are developing with a partner that is called Global Parametrics, and we apply currently to the Democratic Republic of Congo in collaboration with the World Bank. We are both, on one hand, we use big data, we use weather forecast in order to, and machine learning to estimate what is going to be the supply shock. But after using an economic model that is based both in macroeconomic account, but also household level data coming from the LSMS, we actually see how markets react, and markets react under different assumptions in order to understand what is the income effect, so the livelihood effect, and also the food insecurity that we can relate more to the life. And two, and that will be the key point, start to have an idea of what is the cost of this if we want to protect a household at different point in time. Next slide, please. Because the key story is we don't want to start to pay people when the crisis is already there, when the damage is done. We know that the intervention will be very costly and it's sometimes quite inefficient. So in this framework, the overall narrative is, in addition of forecasting what can be the impact, is also to have an idea about what is the cost of this different crises in order to be able basically to develop risk transfer product, not at the household level, because in addition, we know that insuring specific household or specific farmers has a number of issues, but more at the sovereign level. And therefore, we can use the financial markets to basically provide an insurance versus this crisis and shock, and basically trigger payment for government, and then government can implement social safety net before the crisis occurs. So we want to avoid it. We just don't want to solve it. Next slide, please. And I mean that, you know, here we were focusing mainly on weather instability and supply shock, but we have a number of institutional aspects, both in terms of conflict and policy responses, like, you know, trade restriction, that can amplify or mitigate some of these crises every time, because no crisis is exactly the same. So we need to be able to have enough data based on history and real fact to calibrate this type of model, but we also need to make sure that we can see in a slightly different environment than last time, how it will manifest. And of course, when you work in a country like DRC, that have a history of conflict, you also hope that some of the future crises may or may not happen under conflict condition. Next slide, please. So that's the end of our presentation. I try to be brief to please Rob and to let people question, but really I think that, yes, to summarize, having this real-time monitoring is very important, both using remote sensing, but having also check with boots on the ground or boots on a cell phone, depending on how you want to connect to people and understand what is happening. But we really want also to develop a system that provides the financial means and the risk management strategy to mitigate this crisis before they are fully blown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, also for interesting work underway. Of course, we want many people may want answers now, but I think it's good to see we see so much progress made towards near-term real monitoring system, not just by way of sets of indicators, but also of analytical capacity to identify, predict, project, and hopefully also timely act in terms of responsiveness. Okay, they were all excellent presentations. So we've run a little bit over time, unfortunately, for what we had scheduled. We still have about 15 minutes left for the discussion and Q&A session. So first, before getting there, let me inform everybody that we will make all the presentations available through the food security portal after this webinar. So let me now turn to Summer to see what questions have been raised in the chat. And otherwise, we'll go to also the panelists with the questions that are here on the screen. Summer, over to you.
Okay, one of the questions we had was actually one of our discussion questions here. What opportunities exist for collaboration among these different types of tools that we've seen? Where are there opportunities for more collaboration between institutions and research groups?
Okay. Okay. Well, that's more a question to everybody. Are there other more specific questions, or shall we take this one first?
A specific question for both Chris and Kathy were about how were these types of models going to be robust under the current situation and in the current pandemic that we're facing if we're not focused on, if this is driven by not driven by climatic factors.
Okay, thanks, Summer. Maybe let's me first turn to what I called in the beginning the practitioners, Arif, Laura, and Mario, how they can see collaboration that would also serve your purposes of not just being out in the early warning systems, but also out in the field to address crisis and to give emergency responses. Let me start with Arif.
Sorry, I'm just trying to. Okay. No, thank you. I think I really enjoyed all the presentations. For me, I mean, what David was saying at the end resonates quite a bit, meaning monitoring systems are only good if they run when whether it's hot or cold. Because if it only runs when it's hot, you don't need a monitoring system. That's one side of the issue. The second one is that what is the purpose? Get the wrong right. And for us, the purpose is quite clear in terms of, one, to find those hotspots through monitoring if it is running 24/7, 365, but also when we are providing assistance or some other event happens, to see if that is making a difference. I'll give you an example of after in Yemen, the peace agreement was signed in Sudan a year and a half ago. Suddenly you started to see that the Yemeni rial was appreciating. And within the 3 days, 4 days, you could see that people's diet was improved. So it is that type of analysis. Now, coming back to your question about how can we collaborate better, like I said before, it is one, sharing information as a public good. So we are not doubling, tripling the same type of effects. People actually know that there's somebody doing this or not. I think that's really, really important. And then the second thing is to build on what exists. So none of these things which we have talked about are perfect, but they are enough to start the discussion amongst partners to say, okay, you guys are doing this, this is a way of doing it better, or cheaper, or faster, all of those. And we are seeing that dissemination matters. Unless people know you have it, they're not going to come to you. And we sometimes both in academia and also here, we get so busy doing what we are doing that we don't spread as it should go. So for me, I mean, these type of seminars where we can bring people from different sectors are very useful, not because of just see what I'm doing, but more so to see how we can do it better. What are the collaborations that we can take forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Arif. And so well, we definitely do a repeat of this webinar, but I think the question also more how truly you can collaborate moving forward, and not just sharing information, but also make use of these analytical frameworks that the four last speakers have been laying out. Laura, what's your take on this?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Rob. I completely agree with Arif on sort of the primary importance of data sharing across the boots on the ground or the fingers on the cell phone, as it may be, for all of the reasons he mentioned. I think we are sort of best when we're able to work together to fill gaps, to work hard not to duplicate efforts in our own for our own efficiencies, but maybe even most importantly for the populations from whom we are trying to get data. I think that there are a number of ways where that is already happening, both formally and informally. I think FuseNet enjoys both formal and informal data and information sharing relationships with several of the other panelists who presented today. I think maybe in addition, I think to the data sharing, and this gets maybe to the second part of the question around better collaboration among the implementers and academia and other research institutions that are thinking about similar questions, and sometimes from the same angle, sometimes from a little bit of a different angle. to date, a lot of those collaborations are informal, and I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that. But it really does come in spaces like these or other informal, more informal settings where, for example, FuseNet has had the opportunity to work alongside Dan and colleagues at Tufts, or to exchange with Kathy and colleagues on some of the remote or some of the machine learning and AI work that they are doing. So I think I think there is a lot of collaboration happening, but I think there is a need for a lot more collaboration to really work at understanding sort of who's doing what, where are the gaps, and maybe sort of fundamentally what are the specific questions that we are each trying to answer, because that defines then how you're able to collaborate. And I think we often find that we're asking similar questions, but not always the same questions. And so when you're trying to then put together your data, you can end up in a little bit of the more dissonant space if you're not really clear on what the questions you're trying to answer mutually are.
Yeah, thanks, Laura, and well, that maybe also gives me to think maybe we should find ways to bring this better together into a platform for collaboration, not just for the information sharing, but on the collaboration, also on the analytics that has to go with this. Mario, quick thought on this?
Yeah, well, I cannot be, not in line with Arif and Laura on the importance of sharing and collaborate, sharing information. And as Arif said, I have always the feeling that there is already a lot of information, and it's important to work together. My experience is that platforms like, for example, GeoGlam or the NASA Harvest are working very well, putting together different actors from users, academia, institutions at international and national level. And this is the best way to go ahead. And I would like to underline also the need, what it's my perception, to increase the collaboration between organizations like FAO, WFP, and FuseNet with the academia, because the three organizations they have an important value added, that is the presence in the field. And we have to always remind that, well, we can have great models, remote sensing, whatever, but the ground truthing is still an important element. And I believe that these institutions, they have an impressive network of offices, people, technicians, that academia can tap on them to transfer or to double check what they do at universities. And that's it from my side.
Okay, thanks, Mario. I guess we all share that sentiment, and maybe after this seminar, we should find more ways to make that collaboration happen moving forward. Chris and Kathy, there's also a more specific question addressed to you. You'd like to respond to those? Chris first.
Sure. So I think it's obviously true that we all benefit from collaboration. I suspect Kathy would agree that the role of academic institutions is really twofold. One is to help train a cadre of skilled analysts who understand the methods and concepts and go to work with operational agencies. Second is to vet methods and data series and things. We're trying to do upstream research, but it's only useful if it proves to be taken up by and is informed by operational agencies. The very good question that was posed to Kathy and me, yeah, COVID poses a really interesting challenge for these sorts of models, because the type of shock is quite different than what we've been seeing in other food emergencies, which have been driven largely by either natural disasters, droughts and floods and major storms and things like that, where we can see the impacts on the ground from remote sensing data streams from satellites, or they're caused by violence or some sort of other political disruptions that we likewise can pick up from any of a variety of crowdsourced data streams. Here we've got something completely different. We don't have this kind of shock in any of our data sets. So we have no idea, frankly, if we're going to be able to predict these sorts of, predict the prevalence of problems from existing data series. We're going to find that out as things proceed. And this really just underscores the point that many people have made, that boots on the ground can't be replaced. What we're really trying to do is supplement that, where, like in the current situation, you can't get people out face-to-face interviewing households. This is just a problem under a pandemic. Can we use available information to generate tolerably accurate estimates? We're going to find out. I wouldn't want to wager a lot of money that we can, but it's worth trying.
Thanks, Chris. Cassie, we're going to give you the final word before we're going to close, because we've run out of time. But just a quick response, Chris.
Sure. Just quickly. I mean, one thing about the ways to integrate sort of some of the work that the academics are doing with the folks that do have the boots on the ground. I mean, ideally, any of these models would be adaptive, right? So we'd spit out projections, see where they actually work and where they're really bad, right? Where we're off, where we get it right, where we get it wrong, iterate. Try and, and so again, these models should be being updated with ideally work from people on the ground, so that we can make them better. I think they can also be used possibly to identify places where we need more boots on the ground, where we really aren't understanding what's going on, and we sort of, all right, we're doing a great job of predicting here, we maybe don't need to sample here as often, but over here, this is a place that we don't understand what's going on, let's double down here. Lastly, in terms of the question about COVID, I mean, and I like Chris and many others, I'm sure, have been thinking about this, because yeah, this is something I think certainly our current model is not here to pick it up. I think trying to do a better model of places that are economically vulnerable would be very useful, not just for COVID, but for other kind of economic income-related shocks that are not inherently agricultural in nature. And I think that's a place where we need more work, and I think would be quite useful.
Thank you, Kathy. Okay, we're now in the time. I have to close the seminar, so we're going to apologize to Dan and to David not to allow them to speak in the response to the questions raised, but and also apologies to the many people on the call that participated in this webinar. That have given us a large number of questions in addition to the ones we just responded to. So what we promised to do is two things out of the seminar. First, we'll set up an online discussion on the food security portal, where we will address the questions that you've raised, and may also ask the panelists to help us answer some of those questions. And we will organize maybe later in the year, early next year, another webinar to assess further where we are, and in the meantime also promote ways that this kind of information sharing and collaboration can truly take effect. So I'm truly sorry we couldn't delve more into this. So let's take it. This is just the beginning of a discussion. Let's also hope that as the Chinese word of crisis goes, the crisis we're living in now is not just, as the Chinese word says, the danger or risk, but also an opportunity that we should seize on. And I think by bringing these various actors, researchers, practitioners together, I hope that's a good starting point to make a lot more progress in this area, such that we're much better prepared for the next crisis, even if it's a very unknown, a new phenomenon, that at least that we know that we have systems in place that we can quickly monitor the risk that people run, particularly on the food security and hunger front, and that we can prevent the worst from a crisis like this also turning into the first food crisis. So with this, I'm going to close this webinar and thank all the panelists and thank everybody online who's participated through this this long session, but I found it a very fascinating session. Hope you did as well. And as I mentioned, we'll continue this discussion online and in follow-up webinars. Thank you very much.